Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stand. Today we're looking at Ryan Crouser and his 250 kilo front squat and why that might be useful for the sport of shot put or just power training in general. Now, Ryan Crouser is a 3-time Olympic gold medalist, 2-time world champion, and he is possibly one of the greatest shot putters ever. He has thrown 23.56 meters. I guess you could say Ryan is pretty good at the sport of shot put. Now, let's take a look at this 250 kilo front squat from Ryan. Now, if you're a fay with sports training, strength training, track and field, shot put, you'll know that a 250 kilo front squat is absolutely gargantuan. A 250 kilo back squat of any form is a massive lift for any athlete or strength training athlete to perform, let alone a front squat. On top of that, Ryan is a 6'7" athlete, so the depth he's getting here in these are incredibly impressive. These are full range of motion front squats. And we need to look at why might he be using these in his training and why do they appear so frequently throughout the years. When we look back through Ryan's training, if we go all the way back through his Instagram and his YouTube, we'll see that the front squat is one of his main strength movements and it's been there for quite literally years. So if we look at the sport of shot put, we'll categorize shot put as a power sport. A power sport is a sport where we're doing a huge amount of work as quickly as possible over as short a period of time as is necessary to complete that sport-specific action. In this case, it is throwing the shot put. It is different from endurance. It's slightly different from sprinting. It's different from a field sport where we've longer, more drawn-out intricacies to those games, and they wouldn't be as specific to power development as shot put would be. So we categorize this as a power sport where we're trying to maximize this attribute among other things. We're trying to push the power attribute of our athletes as far as possible to hopefully maximize our sport-specific performance for those athletes. So front squatting is part of that training that we see very frequently for Ryan. And generally, when we look at power sports training and we look at their template, they'll follow a very similar template to a lot of different sports with some differences in the nuance. So periodization is a very common form of training, and periodization is not really a product. It's a common issue we see sometimes with people saying that periodization isn't very good. Periodization is something that is incorrect, but all training is actually periodized. Periodized is simply meaning from moving from a less well-trained state to a more well-trained state. Periodization isn't a product, it's the method by which humans get better at sport. It's the template, it's a name given to the physiological development of moving from that space where you're not as good as where you want to be now to where you want to be in the future. Any specific nuances or changes in there come down to programming differences, not particularly periodization differences. Periodization is something that everyone does. If, for example, you squat 100 kilos now and you want to squat 120 kilos in the future, your training is going to move through a periodized training. And once you look back at that, once you get to that goal, you will be able to put periodization over that. So remember, periodization isn't programming. Periodization is just the theory given to how you progress through training. There's good arguments against certain types of programming and periodization, but in general, they'll follow a pretty normal template or a pretty usual template. And that generally starts off with non-specific training, which is not the shot put in this case. And we start off with maybe some hypertrophy work. We might start off with some maximal strength work. We might start off with some general physical prepared work before that. So we're very non-specific. And if you want to conceptualize this, this is often at the bottom of the triangle. We're as far away from the top of the triangle as we will ever be for the sport. At the top of the triangle, we are looking at shot put. That is as specific as we can get. And we start down here at the bottom. Now, these will meld together a little bit, these extra steps through that triangle. Our GPP phase will have a lot of the movements that our strength phase will have, and then we'll blend in some of our power training, and we'll never really stop throwing the shot put throughout our career. We'll always be practicing. But if we're putting these large templates or large kind of Venn diagrams on them, we'll see that larger sections take hold for certain periods of that training. So at the start of this training, those first two phases will move from strength GPP into a maximal strength phase, into our power phase, and then into our sport-specific phase. Now, they'll blend nicely. Sometimes we'll see a very hard stop between one phase and the other. We'll make a very definitive stop between, okay, we're no longer going to be doing sled pushes today. We're going to move on to our strength phase. We're going to move away from our GPP phase. Or what we might see is a nice blending where we'll kind of titrate in a little bit of squatting and we'll move through those phases. But one of the most important phases for power athletes is the strength phase. The stronger you are, the better potential you have to be faster. It's a large portion of that equation. If you can produce a lot of force, it's a very important part of the power equation. And high force movements are things like the front squat. Now, In this particular case, Ryan has chosen the front squat to be one of his favorite movements for high force output. And given that he's front squatting 250 kilos, we're certainly meeting the demands for a high force movement. One of the benefits to high force movement is that the heavier a weight gets for these high force movements or these high strength movements is the recruitment of certain motor units. Now, some of these motor units are not recruited until we get very, very heavy, near 1RM, generally around 90%. The difference between 90% and 100% is quite small, but the difference between 20% of your 1 rep max and 90% of your 1 rep max is massive. So these motor units aren't really recruited. These fast twitch fiber units are recruited incredibly well as weights get very, very heavy. There's other ways we can train them, but one of the better ways we can train them before we get to the sport specific attributes is these high force training. This is why it works incredibly well for a variety of sports. It's why we can make S&C training so general, because we can just do strength training and we can make it somewhat specific. But by and large, most strength training will look very, very similar across a variety of sports. If we go from an MMA athlete to a soccer player to a shot putter to a marathon runner, a lot of the movements they'll do in the gym will be quite similar. There'll be some differences in frequency, there might be some differences in movements, but movement patterns will remain largely the same. We'll see most of them squatting, or at least we will have most of them squatting. We'll see a lot of them deadlifting, and then we might see some nuances in how often they'll front squat, how often they'll back squat. And then we'll see some of them or a lot of them doing some Olympic lifts, which was what we see Ryan doing. So in this phase, the start phase, we've moved from our GPP phase and we're into our maximal strength phase. Generally from that maximal strength phase then, we will move to a power phase. And this looks like a lot like the hang power snatches that Ryan frequently does in his training. Now these hang power snatches are that phase before we might get to that sport specific phase when we're periodizing it or trying to categorize that in those periods, is this high speed phase or this high power output phase. And he will start using movements, and he seems to favor movements like the hang power snatch. Hang power snatch is really well correlated with shot put performance. In particular, snatching is something that seems to be really well correlated with it. And one of the ways we can get better at hang power snatches is by squatting large amounts of weight. So these, again, if you think about these in separate brackets, we have our non-specific training for our hang power snatch. This is our front squat. We're getting some benefits for a shot put, but we're going through a sequence of supporting movements here. We're front squatting to get better at our hang power snatch. We're front squatting to get better motor unit recruitments. And as a result, then we're getting better at our power snatch. And then as a result of that, then we're hopefully getting better at our shot put. So see how we're moving from non-specific movements, which are important for training. They don't look like the gym. We're not recreating the shot put in the gym. We're not using really heavy shot puts. We're not using cables with resisted movements to try and get specific to the shot put. We're simply looking at what attributes do we need. And then you, as the athlete, or Ryan here in this case, makes those attributes specific to the sport. He makes them trainable. Once we bring up these well of attributes, this power, this speed, this force output, we can then make them specific to that sport with good technical practice, adequate smart loading of that sport specific practice, aka the shot put, and then we in the result then hopefully get an improvement in performance. Now there's another interesting aspect about Ryan's training that is incredibly useful, and that is a measurement of velocity. So when it comes to velocity training or measurements of velocity in the strength movements or in our power movements, for strength training athletes, maybe for weightlifters, for powerlifters, these are largely useless. They're not really that productive if you've good programming in place already. They can be useful to see those numbers, but they don't really help you dictate good decisions. And there's quite a bit of research coming out in velocity-based training showing that it's not that useful. But aside from that, no real coaches use velocity-based training in weightlifting, and very, very few that I know have used them in strength training. And that's not a knock on velocity-based training, because velocity-based training for athletes is incredibly useful. And we'll see Ryan hitting PBs on the same lift for velocity-based training. So you'll see in this 250, you might think, oh, that looks pretty fast. He could probably do more. But you'll see Ryan is very, very conscious of still moving that barbell faster. So this is really interesting. The faster we can move heavier weights, the likelihood is the better power output we're getting, or the better we're giving ourselves a chance to have better power output. So if Ryan can hang power snatch 140 kilos at a certain speed, and a year later he can hang power snatch 140 kilos faster, we know that we've largely kept those other variables quite similar. The hang power snatch, he probably hasn't got longer arms. 140 kilos should be remaining 140 kilos. If he can move it faster to the completion of the lift, then we know that hopefully his power attributes, his general power output has gotten better, And as a result, then he can move to his sport-specific performance and hope to then make that more powerful and increase the distance he's throwing the shot put. In the same way, we'll see him measuring a lot of his front squats, and he's been measuring them for years, which is very, very interesting. And he's trying to hit PBs at same weights by moving those weights faster. So he's trying to measure as best as possible while not compromising his force training, or not compromising it so much that he's not getting any fast training. Because you could say, why doesn't he just move 100 kilos really fast? But we still need those high threshold motor units. We still need that high force output from those heavy weights to get this training done. And so if we can move these really heavy weights, because 250 is both subjectively and objectively very heavy. It's heavy for Ryan because it's a PB, but it's just heavy for a lot of people. We can set minimum standards on these movements and how heavy we might like to see people moving. But those upper limits then are really individual based. And this 250 kilos, if Ryan does this again in a year's time and moves it faster, if he increases that meters per second, he knows that his power output has gotten better. And as a result then, he has given himself a great chance at being a better shot putter. So you can see he seems very, very clinical with his training, and he's chosen the front squat as something as one of his main movements. This might be for a variety of reasons. He might have found that this just worked really well for him. Or he might find that he just preferred front squatting over back squatting, because in general we'll usually see shot putters or throwers using the back squat, and usually then we'll see them using back squats to boxes, which in the right place can be quite useful, as we've talked about before. But generally the larger range of motion full depth squats we find are more useful for these athletes. I want to give you one extra tip on the front squat. If you're thinking about using the front squat for your training and you're thinking, you know what, I'm an athlete and I'm a power athlete and I want to get better at throwing, one of the best ways to improve your front squat is actually just to increase your back squat. Now, I did a bit of digging and I couldn't find a lot of back squatting from Ryan, but what I did find years ago was 300 kilos to about parallel box squat, moving outrageously fast for a double. And I was wondering, did Ryan always favor the front squat? Because it's not that you can't front squat and not get better at it. The front squatting will make you better at front squatting. But if you really want to launch your front squat off, increasing your back squat is a very effective way. And if you have those heavier weights, if you're using these heavier weights in the back squat, it's such a faster way of getting better at front squatting. And we've seen this quite literally thousands of times, both personally and with loads of athletes. If we need to blow up our front squat, increasing your back squat is a better way. The reason for that is that the front squat is something that's incredibly fatiguing. We need a lot more postural strength. The fatigue we also seem to get from front squats is very draining. It seems very, very neural for a lot of athletes. A heavy front squat is something that can drain you for up to 10, 15 days. It seems quite similar to the deadlifts, and it's not something that's talked about hugely, but we see it quite frequently. Athletes, and again, experience it ourselves. If you front squat really heavy, if you're going for that balls out single, you're probably compromising the rest of your training for a preceding period of time, and you're very likely quite fatigued for up to 7 to 10 days. We see that quite frequently. So one of the better ways of trying to get our big front squat is just having a massive back squat. Increasing the back squat is just easier. It's a little bit less technical. The postural demands in your upper body are less demanding. It's less fatiguing to move those heavier weights. For example, front squatting 180 kilos is a massive lift. It's quite honestly a lift that a lot of people won't ever make, but repping 180 kilos in the back squat is much more productive. And if we're trying to front squat 180 kilos, if you can back squat 180 for 3 or 4 reps, there's a good chance you will have a possibility of front squatting it. But if you can only barely back squat 160 kilos and currently you're front squatting 160 kilos, you're going to have a very long and arduous journey to get to that 180 kilos. So if you're trying to use the front squat, go right ahead. It can be an incredible lift to use, but be super conscious of your back squat numbers. And we'll see in this case, Ryan is able to move 300 kilos at 0.7 meters per second on the box squat, and he is moving that barbell. You'll see his posture is immaculate. His technique looks very, very good. There's a good reason then he's able to move these big front squats. And if you've done those numbers before, Ryan doesn't necessarily need to train the back squat super frequently right now to keep that front squat high. On top of that, of course, Ryan is an incredibly talented athlete, one of the most talented athletes, certainly when it comes to the power output section of training. And as such, the front squat and moving those heavy weights is going to be a little bit easier for him because he's genetically predisposed to it. So don't make this mistake of look at your own training and thinking, I'm just going to front squat, because I promise you it's a very hard route. It's needlessly hard to do that. The front squat is something that is a great exercise, but do try and support it with other movements like the back squat. Maybe you could use the safety bar squat if you wanted to, if you didn't particularly love using back squats in general. The box squat would be an option, but again, you're going very, very heavy there. So we want a little bit of a compromise. We don't want to go super heavy. We don't want to be doing huge box squats, which may increase injury risk due to the heavy weight, the setup. Far better to do some back squats with a full range of motion to support your front squat. So I hope you gave that some idea on the theory of why Ryan is probably using the front squat for his throwing. Whatever he's doing, it's certainly working, and his training seems really interesting. It seems really diligent. He seems really interested in all aspects of his training, and he seems super thoughtful about everything he does, which I love to see. Those velocity-based movements for strength training athletes, not that useful. But if you're an athlete, if you're training, you're doing S&C, I would recommend looking into getting some way of measuring that velocity. Now, you and your coach can often just look at that barbell and say, oh, that's definitely moving faster. But it is nice to have some numbers. It doesn't impact training. Try not to make too many decisions in your off-season based on your velocity training. But in the in-season, it can be quite useful. Okay, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If there's other lifts or other athletes you've been like, why are they doing that? Please let us know below. We love seeing it and love looking through it and trying to explain why they might be doing that. In the off chance, Ryan, you see this video, I know sometimes you're on YouTube, congratulations on your medal, and keep up the training vlogs, because it's great to see athletes training, and it's great to see athletes in the gym training, especially when they're moving lifts like Ryan is.